Hey everyone, and welcome to Writing Our Way Out, the podcast. This is the show about writing your way toward the true core of life. My name is Dave Coogan, and this show is based on the book, Writing Our Way Out, Memoirs from Jail, the creative culmination of a writing class that I started at the Richmond City Jail and that grew into a journey of reentry with 10 men. Today's show, The Prison of White Supremacy. When police officers in Minneapolis murdered an unarmed black man, George Floyd, on May 25th, 2020, protesters in Richmond made it clear with their spray paint and their ropes that Confederate monuments were not just archaic fragments of history, they were living legacies to slavery, Jim Crow law, lynching, segregation, police brutality, and mass incarceration. But now that the narrative supporting this way of life has begun to come undone, what more do we need to do? How can we break free from the prison of white supremacy? This is Writing Our Way Out, the podcast, episode 10, The Prison of White Supremacy. And with me on the show today to help break down this topic is Stan Craddock. Stan is a lifelong Richmond resident, a self-taught Bible scholar, an unaffiliated inspirational preacher, a master gardener and facilities manager, and one of the authors of Writing Our Way Out, Memoirs from Jail. Welcome to the show, Stan.
Well, thank you, Dave. Wonderful introduction.
Of course, nothing but the best for you.
Okay.
And joining Stan is Chris Graham. Chris is a North Carolinian living in Richmond since 2016. He is an historian and the curator of exhibitions at the American Civil War Museum. He is also a member of St. Paul's Episcopal Church and the author of its racial self-study titled Blind Spots, Race and Identity in a Southern Church. Welcome, Chris. And joining Chris is Dale Broomfield. Dale is the full-time field director for Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, a Richmond-based nonprofit devoted to ending the state's death penalty. He is also the author of 11 books, including Virginia State Penitentiary, A Notorious History, and his latest, Railroaded, the true stories of the first 100 people executed in Virginia's electric chair. In addition, Dale has extensively written and spoken publicly on mass incarceration, the death penalty, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, and the underground press of the 1960s. Find out more at dalebroomfield.net. And welcome, Dale.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Dale is joined by Danita Roundtree Green. Danita is the author, playwright, and transformational storyteller and trauma-informed care specialist addressing historical and race-related issues in the former capital of the Confederacy. She is also the co-founder and co-CEO of Coming to the Table RVA, a nonprofit committed to racial healing in Richmond, Virginia. Check it out at DanitaRoundtreeGreen.com. Welcome, Danita.
Thank you for the plug, and thank you, Dave. Glad to be here tonight.
Oh, happy to plug the good work you do. And last but not least on our panelists tonight, Chelsea Higgs Wise. Chelsea is a mom, a clinical social worker, and an activist. She hosts Race Capital, a popular weekly radio show that airs on WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio, Wednesdays at 10 a.m. She is also the co-founder and executive director of Marijuana Justice, a nonprofit that works to repeal the prohibition of cannabis and to reinvest in our communities. Chelsea's nonprofit work in 2020 has been aligned with the movement for Black Lives, hashtag Black Lives Matter. You can find her at chelseahiggswise.com. Welcome, Chelsea.
So happy to be here. Thanks, David.
Thank you all for being here. Okay, so in tonight's show, we are going to investigate how to get out of the prison of white supremacy. And to get into this topic, I am going to ask Stan to open up the show for us by reading a selection from his writings from the book that we wrote together, the book that started at this little writing class that we started at the jail. The book is Writing Our Way Out, Memoirs from Jail. Stan is going to read a piece about when he was in prison.
Count is clear. Count is clear. We heard one morning on the PA system at Lunenburg Correctional Facility. Every man's ears are tuned to that system. Work call, work call. Doors started flying, men moving to their assigned spots on the ground. But I'm waiting on rec call. All I want to do is dash at top speeds towards a giant slab of concrete that houses thousands of pounds of cold steel plates, bars that could rip the flesh off the palm of your hands, and benches stained with sweat and blood. My first bit was done on a slab of concrete. What doesn't kill you can only make you strong. This was our mindset: punish or be punished. Add another plate, and then when you can't handle that, add another plate. Sweat, blood, and tears. I'm a member of the Dumb Dudes Club. We are the best looking guys in here. Rock hard abs, chest, bulging biceps, legs like tree trunks, but with minds like babies. We think how you look is all that matters in life. What's on the outside? We don't know what I've only just recently came to suspect: that life isn't always about me. It's about discovering the beauty that lies dormant inside your fellow human being. It's about giving love and then receiving it. It's the solution to the prison problem that you never hear about. Aren't they smart enough to understand our problems? They know the solution, but they whisper it among themselves, not allowing us to hear. See, jails and prisons are not really about bricks and bars to me. No, it's not about shackles and chains, and guards and guns and razor wire fences. When you look at me, you won't see any of the above, at least not on the outside of who I appear to be. But if you x-ray me with your mind, listen to my words, have a chance to look into my eyes, here, I'll help you. You'll need a light though, because it's dark in my world. But trust me, when your light meets my darkness, you'll see the bars, you'll see the chains, you'll see despair, hopelessness, and gloom. You'll see things that chain me to childhood. You'll see the wounds that have been festering for years. You'll see the prison inside of me. I've been released from prison over and over again, but I've never really been free.
Yeah. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you.
That was great. I want to get into this now with the question of how he got there. He says in the last line, "I've been released from prison over and over again, but never been freed." And I'm wondering if the prison is bigger than the actual one that he was in at that moment at Lunenburg Correctional when he wrote that. If the prison is bigger than that, How did that prison get made? Christopher, can I start with you? How did the prison of white supremacy get made?
Um, Thank you, David, and sorry for being muted earlier when I said hey to everyone here. Um, so, in I think in terms of the landscape and historical landscape that we're looking at, we see the prison of white supremacy being born, of course, very early in this state's and this nation's history. Um, what interests me about Richmond and the Commonwealth we live in today is what was created during the time of slavery, particularly the time of 19th century slavery, and a narrative of racial difference that survived the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment in 1865. And so briefly, what I mean by the narrative of racial difference is the idea that white people generated to help justify slavery, the about the competence of white people, the benevolence of white people, and the dangerous incompetence of black people, and the necessity of some way to manage the relationships between the two and the obligations between the two. Now, of course, before 1865, the tool for managing that was slavery, but after that, we discovered, the biggest lesson that we can get here is that white supremacy adapts itself to new circumstances and always changes and always brings in new tools. And so by the turn of the 20th century, we see kind of a new justification for a managed relationship between white people and black people that still relies on that narrative of white competence and black dangerous incompetence, but it works in the world of politics in the way that it restricts voting rights and restricts access to political activity. Works in the world of residential and economic landscapes where residential areas are segregated, where where jobs are restricted to white people, not black people. But to me, what's most important about this and kind of survives and is given a boost by the lost cause is the historical imagination that we have at work here. And this is something again that white people create. And um, and it basically says that uh, in the South, white people and black people are happy together, and that they were happy together in slavery, and that white people took care of black people in slavery. And it justifies the economic and social and cultural relationships of Jim Crow 20th century, in which that black people should be happy with an ordered, hierarchical, unequal race relations in work, in politics, in public life in the American South, and that anyone who exceeds those expectations are either ignored, not seen in history, not seen in our historical imagination, and otherwise kind of marginalized by the state's political and in various points over time criminal justice system. And so
Right.
it's changed over time, but some things remain the same.
Yeah, I'm glad you ended on where you did on the way it led to the changes in the criminal justice system. Dale, you've written extensively on this in Virginia. Can you share with us how this history that Chris has outlined formed our prisons, the kinds that Stan eventually went into?
Yeah, I was thinking while Chris was talking that really the prison of white supremacy in Virginia started just after the Civil War, when Virginia desired to move technologically forward and not linger with the antebellum South, who wanted to remain agrarian after the Civil War. Virginia wanted to go forward, and to do that, they needed to make connections in the North and the West. To do that, they had to build railroads. It was when they were building these railroads that they discovered they needed more help building these railroads, and they hit upon the idea of using penitentiary prisoners to help build these railroads. Well, the warden of the penitentiary said, wait a minute, we're manufacturing shoes, nails, farm implements, things like that. I can't be sending you all my prisoners. I need them here to work. And so they came up with the convict leasing program at that point. And with convict leasing, the railroads would lease convicts from the penitentiary to go to work on the railroads in the western part of the state. This is where, of course, the legend of John Henry emerged. What they quickly found out was that this could be a money-making project. And so to expand westward and northward technologically, we needed more convicts to build these railroads. So the General Assembly responded by coming up with what they call black codes. The black codes were implemented by the Assembly, in which they knew that newly freed slaves were frequently guilty of petty crimes for stealing. They were hungry, they had no jobs, they had no money, they had no future. And so they created laws that created very strict and severe punishments for such simple crimes as housebreaking or simple theft. They could arrest a black man who was just standing on someone else's property under the assumption he was about to commit a felony. He could get 10 years in the penitentiary for that nonsense crime. There was another crime I found that a black man could be arrested for showing an air of satisfaction about the end of the Civil War. He could draw a couple of years in the penitentiary. And as soon as they were in the penitentiary, off they go on trains out west to serve on the railroads to achieve this technological progress that Virginia desired. Of course, none of this was covered in the newspapers because the newspapers were owned by the railroads back then, except for the Planet. And the Planet rarely, for some reason, reported on these things. So it was the quest to move forward from the Civil War that first started creating the post-emancipation prison of white supremacy, from what I've seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But before I get to Chelsea and Danita to get their reactions to this, Stan, from what you've heard so far about the origins of the prison that you landed in, what have you taken from Christopher and Dale? Does any of that surprise you? Is it new to you, or is it just old hat?
None of it surprises me at all. Simply because I understand that in order to lead, you have to have some followers, and sometimes people will follow you, right? Simply because you have created the situation for them to follow you. You know, like the gentleman said, is that guys had no jobs. But what struck me the most was he said they had no future, and they were being thrown in prison or through the judicial system because of the lack of opportunities. So it was a well thought out plan.
Yeah. Danita, let me ask you, because this is something that you've studied and also worked with countless people who have traced their history back to this time period and are trying to dig out from the personal trauma that they've been through, just knowing that this is part of their lives. Can you reflect on what you've heard so far from?
Well, I can, Dave, and I'm going to say I'm probably going to take the conversation in a very different direction.
Oh, okay.
So be ready. Put your seatbelts on. So, what we do in coming to the table, as you know, we share very intimate stories. And as a trauma-informed care specialist dealing specifically with generational trauma, the question always comes up at the table. Remembering that our great disadvantage did not necessarily start here in this country. It started in another country. When we think about where our enslavers came from, they came from a place of great fear in Britain. We like to keep the idea that we're all, those that came on the Mayflower were the descendants of kings and queens and all of that. But no, that's not what it was. These were people that were fleeing something heinous in the land of their ancestors and brought that fear over here to this shore, wanting never to go back to the condition that they were in there. And their way of moving from that condition was in some ways to bring that heinous crime here, creating a system of supremacy that would allow them never to go back, never to go back to where they came from and the treatment that they received. And what has kept that going? What has kept that system moving? Fear. All of it is fear. And when we sit across the table from each other at coming to the table, I will admit, I was one of the first people, I'll be one of the first people to admit when I started work in racial healing and having the difficult conversations on race, I did it primarily and solely, actually, thinking about what African Americans had been through, what Black bodies had been through in this country. Never really thinking at all how hard it is in some ways to be the bearer of the protagonist, the enslaver. What skeletons are in those closets? That's what we hear about at the table. What trauma that they carry from generation to generation. And it's not going to be until we work through that trauma, more so the trauma of our white family. We have to work through our trauma of our white family before we can get to the root of why we were enslaved as Africans, and why this fear and hatred still persists today. That's a lot. That's a lot. And I believe that we're just coming to a place in our history because of all the things we had, the COVID pandemic, and now we're in the race pandemic, which took us a long time to get here. But we're finally at a place that I believe we can crack this thing open and get to the healing. But the history was already set before the first foot landed in this country. The racism and the need to move through it and from it was already a part of the scheme.
Yes, yes. I'm glad you brought that up and took the conversation that way. It's something that I've thought about a lot actually in the years I've spent teaching at the jail and getting to know Stan and the others I've worked with, is that a lot of what I'm digging out from under is what's been imprisoning me, and the prison of white supremacy is a prison that imprisons us all. And if I neglected to say that in the opening, then let me correct it here, because it's something that I truly believe blocks everybody's freedom, not just the freedom of people who are physically incarcerated or discriminated against. We all can't see the horizon of justice when some of us are blocked from the passage. Now, I know that when we move forward from the death of George Floyd with the protests, that there was a multiracial group protesting. And I remember, Stan, do you remember when we talked on the phone about that?
Yes, I do, Dave.
Yeah, that was one of the things that you were real excited about, was to see how many white people were coming to join with Black people.
Well, I have moved forward from the color to people now, because truly all lives do matter. But I have to say that if you are a person of color, you look like me, all my life, I have walked around this prison of racial inequality, white supremacy. I come up with Black power, and I have walked around this institution because it's a place of confinement. Not just for being a man of color, but also for being a white man. It's a place of confinement because you can't get out and I can't get out. We both trapped in it. And that's the reason why I love participating in a narrative like this. I'm learning a whole lot, Dave.
Well, we're gonna keep that going, because I wanted to ask Chelsea to jump in and reflect on that, because I know you spent some time with the protesters and did
I
your own
did.
work on this. Well, so Chelsea, tell me what you saw in that moment of people coming together to say no to the prison of white supremacy. Did you see what Stan is talking about? People collectively figuring out a way out, or was it a way out of something deeper, like what Christopher or Dale or Danita were talking about in the history of the formation of the country?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to say that. So, for folks that do not know, I was heavily involved with the protest. Being an organizer and being with the youth that were out there was probably my top priority this past summer. I've been joking that I am a elder millennial. I am 35 years old, but I felt very wise out in the streets with the youth, and realized that my role in this right now is sharing this information, diving more into this history, and being able to share the narratives for these newly politicized and radical people that are now in the streets. Remember in Richmond, we did not uprise the day that the video surfaced, which was actually the Tuesday of that week. It was the Friday, May 29th, that Richmond decided to uprise. And that was after the very egregious charges that were made public, that there were a third degree manslaughter that was only being charged. And so it was Richmond that we weren't surprised by the murder, unfortunately. It wasn't witnessing this again on TV that got us to move, because we've seen that so many years, specifically since 2015. But it was the idea of this injustice within the system that's supposed to be just that took us to the streets. Now, if you remember, right here in Richmond, Virginia, 2 years ago, we had a police shooting. Marcus David Peters was shot and killed on the side of I-95 when he was naked and suffering from a mental health crisis. He needed health, not death. And many people in that streets, I have my window up so you can hear my streets right now here talking to me. But if you remember that we've been protesting in the street long before May, and it was a collective uprising. And so I want to remind folks right now that Richmond has a recent history of this, but we have a longstanding history. So I want to add a little bit more to the great in-depth history of what we've talked about. But something that I've learned over this past summer that really helped open up my eyes to the history here in Richmond is that about, again, the question of how did we all end up in this prison of white supremacy on this land? Well, my answer would now be it was because of the need of forced labor. And it was always forced labor that gave the idea of white supremacy the tool, right? And the continued tool that we are continuing to use is the racial capitalism tool that gives white supremacy the idea. Right. But I want to be very direct that racial capitalism, the idea of forced labor, the idea of Black labor, many of the events that you all have talked about of after emancipation, and there being no jobs, no quote unquote future. Well, right here in Richmond, if you've done some of the research, you will realize that prior to emancipation, Richmond had the highest number of Black enslaved industrial workers in the South. And so what that means is that many Black enslaved people actually lived in communities not with their overseers, that lived outside of the city on their plantations. So many people lived a lot like it might look like now, not on the plantation, not incarcerated, but still enslaved and still in prison. And I will challenge us to say that's how we are continuing to live right now. Is that we may not be living on the plantation under their roof, but we are still enslaved. We still do not have to say on our jobs. I will continue to really encourage everyone to look back at the history of the Working Men Reforms Party that was right here in Richmond, Virginia, that built the beautiful City Hall. And the reason why that momentum was stomped out was because of this Robert E. Lee statue that we are still fighting for today. When that beautiful Richmond, the old City Hall that was built and no longer in use, but when that contract came through, there was a momentum that happened. And then in order to split up, going back to the this multiracial coalition that we're seeing in the streets today, that's just a reflection of what we saw back then in the 1886, 1887, that was pushing forward with this working reform man's party, a multiracial coalition of laborers. Now, what stomped them out and what has continued to be the backslide was the building and the proposal of the Robert E. Lee Monument that said, you know what? It's not about class. It's not about struggle. It's about race. And we're going to get all the white folks together. The Daughters of the Confederacy came in what I like to call a brilliant strategic plan with education, ceremony, and arts, right? And that is how we got here. But before I end this last segment, I just want to remind everyone, so let's look back and remind that enslavement looked very different from 1619 to 1865. It evolved immensely, including right here in Richmond, Virginia. So if we're asking ourselves, how does this American plantation still very much mimic the one in 1865, then we can see that even though we are living, quote unquote, not under our overseer, we are still, like Stan said, not at all free.
Well said. I want to follow up on some of the claims that Chelsea offered us here. Christopher, perhaps Dale and Danita, you can join in as well. The idea that we needed forced labor to continue the franchise, to develop the country. Could you break that down for us? I mean, you mentioned the railroads, the convict leasing. Could you go into a little bit more depth and take us up to the late 20th century when we get into Stan's story? Chris, maybe I'll start with you, and then Dale and Danita, you can jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to affirm what Kelsey said. That was right on, and add to it a little bit. Certainly, capitalism, one of the defining features of it is that it requires as cheap as labor source as possible. And whether it's the need in the mid 17th century to bind people to owners to ensure that labor is in steady supply, to our present day concerns about minimum wages and living wages, that's a through line in all of it, is the need for cheap labor, and capitalism is what demands that. But what's interesting to me is that kind of as a starting point for slavery and white supremacy, what gets built on top of that and adds to that, and that's certainly kind of political theory and economic theory. But of course, the thing I'm particularly interested in is the religious theory, the theology of pro-slavery, the theology of white supremacy, that kind of moves it from being just an economic concern to a concern that really embraces a worldview, a larger worldview that is all embracing, in which slavery and white supremacy touches everything in society and kind of defines everything in Southern society. So I'll hand it off to Dale or Danita, whoever wants to pick up on that.
Well, can I say?
Go ahead.
No, I definitely want to listen to you.
Oh, well, I was just going to add, just quite simply, there was no real exit plan for slavery. And that's why we are not free now. It was never supposed to end, and therefore, ergo, it has not. It has evolved into many, many different forms. But as my sister says so eloquently, there is no freedom. And I will argue that there is no freedom for Black people, and there is no freedom for white people either in this way, because we have not been able to evolve to the utmost point where we could be a free nation and to be able to reap the benefits of what it would truly mean to be American. We've never seen that. That's why we can't talk to each other. That's why we can't hardly work together. That's why we can't do a whole lot. We can't hardly live together, because we can't even envision, after 400 years, what that freedom could actually look like.
Go ahead, Stan. You've heard her now.
I beg to differ. I think what I'm experiencing, what different people are experiencing, is an energy. Is an energy, right, that's got to be transferred through my generation. It is a freedom call. It is what makes me strong. It is what makes every man strong. And when one man has it, or one nationality has it right, it does not stop the energy, the yearning, the desire for me to march forward. I'm just following the orders of my heart. There's a song that Supremacy need to hear, because this is so true of a song. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California, I don't know the other part, right? But
For the New York Islands.
yeah, to the New York Islands, right? But this is how serious. This is a pivotal moment. I love it. You know why? Because it's going to give birth to something. And it may not come out, our children don't come out the way that we want them to come out. But once the water break, George Floyd, that was just the water breaking. The water been breaking for years. It's time to push. It's time to push for some dialogue. It is time to push to the verge of war. Because who isn't willing to fight for their freedom?
Yeah, I warned you all that he's an unaffiliated preacher.
No, man, I just like that part.
I warned you about that. But I want to pick up on that because he's helping us move forward to where we need to get, which is how do we get free from this prison of white supremacy? We know that it's constructed our labor relations, our social relations. It's become so essential to our social functioning as a people that it's even in our theology and our way of life. Now we're at this moment, as Chelsea put it in her last remarks, that we made a choice a while back to continue on the pathway of building an infrastructure that could sustain us, or building an infrastructure in monuments that can oppress us. And what's happened is that people have come together to protest that decision, and we've seen most of those monuments come down. And where she left us in that comment was where we go from here. And I think Stan and Danita are echoing that. The question now becomes, what do we do from here? How do we break free?
Well, I've been listening to the youth.
David, if I could, I'm sorry.
Chelsea, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Chelsea.
You go ahead, then Dale after her.
Well, I've been listening to the youth all summer. I am an avid reader. I listen to the news. I'm trying to just kind of give my validation for the answer that I'm about to give, which is that everything that I have seen globally, nationally, locally, the first beginning steps to this for our actual safety is to defund the police. The police protect property. Property is about capitalism. Capitalism is never going to actually consider our humanity. It runs off the basis of gaining and earning profits. Therefore, it is never actually about care or people. And in order to start dismantling the power of capitalism, we have to allow certain people, specifically Black and brown people, to move freely within the world, to stand on a corner, to drive down the street with maybe a headlight out and survive a traffic stop. And so the first step to just making sure that we can all get to the table to discuss what our world looks like is to defund the police, put that money back into our community so we decide how to keep ourselves safe. If anybody wants to hit me up, my email and website is chelseahiggswise.com. I would love to talk about how the police do not keep us safe and go through that conversation and give me and hear and talk about examples about police actually do not stop crime. I can also tell you much history about Richmond police and how 1 out of 6, every Black person in Richmond, 1 out of 6 Black people in Richmond will have an interaction with the Richmond Police Department at least once a year, just by data that we had to force out of the Richmond Police Department and our current Mayor LeVar Stoney that he didn't want to give us. So what I'm telling you at the very bottom line, why there is a global uprising is why there is white supremacy. And if we're talking about actually dismantling white supremacy and the transition evolution of white supremacy, KKK, and their actual organization, they moved right from the white hoods to the blue uniform and the black robes. And we need to understand that cops do not keep us safe. Prosecutors are cops, and judges, specifically in Richmond, have been appointed by other racist legislators that are continuing these same harms, specifically on Black men, fathers, uncles, and our family members right here in Richmond, Virginia. So defund the police, step one.
And email her. She's for real about that. She responded to my email right away. Dale, you wanted to get in on that, Dale. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to take what Chelsea said and blow it up to its most logical extreme into my area of expertise, and that's capital punishment. Capital punishment, there's no more obvious example of racial disparity than in the way Virginia runs its capital punishment process. In 1908, they switched to the electric chair to stop large crowds of blacks from gathering at hangings and chanting and praying for the guilty men to go into the promised land. The white legislature said no more of that, so they switched them to the electric chair in a dark basement surrounded by 12 somber white men. Even today, 2021, we're still executing people in Virginia. We have 2 black men on death row. In Virginia, you are 7 times more likely to be executed for a crime than a white person, if you're black, than a white person for the exact same crime. And in Virginia, you are 3 times more likely to be executed if your victim is white than if your victim is black. That is directly putting value on human lives based on their race. And we are still doing that today in Virginia. So that is why in 2021, we are introducing bills in the Senate and the House to end capital punishment once and for all in Virginia. We have killed more people in Virginia since 1608 than any other state, including Texas. 1,390 people, over 1,000 of them were blacks. That has got to end. That is white supremacy in its most raw form.
Dave.
It is, and you can read more about it in his book, Railroaded, The True Stories of the First 100 People Executed in Virginia's Electric Chair at dalebrumfield.net. Go, Stan.
When I was at Greensville, because Greensville's got legal injection. When I was at Mecklenburg housed the chair. I don't think that you sentence a man to death, because I know what a cell can do to you. Cell can drive you crazy. Isolation can drive you crazy. And then furthermore, right, because I've been in penitentiary far too long. When you execute me, hey man, I'm not even gonna be there. Just my body gonna be there. I'm gonna take authority over myself, and I'm gonna go within, and I disappear. All you got was just a shell. That's all you got. Today, we've got to understand how to get out of the prison. The shame thing about it is that some of us, a generation of us, need to die in the prison. Sorry to say that. Some of us need to die simply because you're trying to make it better in prison when you should be throwing ideas on the outside of it, right? And planting seeds. You've got to start with the kindergartners. You've got to start with the child that's in the womb. You got to start it there, because they are a pure seed. Everybody on this panel tainted. And I just think, right, that because we're gonna bring in our experiences, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but we've experienced. We have a learned behavior that's already have been structured. When are we gonna tear our little statues down?
I wanted to ask Danita that because I know, Danita, you are a passionate educator
Yeah.
for racial healing. Could you speak into that, what he's describing?
So I hear all of that, and I'm going to go back to my sister Chelsea and what she was saying about the police. So I definitely agree, mostly as a trauma-informed healer, that we send our police out to handle things that they shouldn't handle. They're not social workers. They're not mental health professionals. They're not counselors. And I've never been in the police training, but I understand that they get more training using a gun than anything else. And
Mm.
most calls don't really call for that kind of violence at all. They may call for some kind of separation or intervention, but not what we're experiencing at all. Um, I know what brought me to this work, and I'll just say very briefly. Um, as a very young person, growing up in the 60s, I was well aware that there was a narrative about me, about my family, about everybody who looked like me that I wasn't a part of. We always talking about getting together and talking about our issues. White people and black people, in my estimation, have never really done that, and which is what brought me to found coming to the table here in the former capital of the Confederacy. We have enriching conversations where I can ask any dumbass question, excuse me, that I want to a person, and they can ask me back, and we can authentically dialogue. And I can listen to Stan, and I can listen to Chelsea, I can listen to Dale and Christopher, I can listen and I can learn something, and together we can move forward. And as I wrap this up, I also want to say that this is imperative, and I agree with my brother here. This is our time to move the needle forward. If we're ever going to be free, this is the time for that. I'm a mother. I have 3 sons and 2 stepsons. That's a lot of testosterone to raise in this America. And I can tell you, from the birth of the first one into puberty and beyond, because they're all grown men, I don't think I have had a good night's sleep since.
Mm.
Not one. Not one. And it doesn't matter how much privilege I think I have, how many degrees I think I have, what part of the city that I live in. It doesn't even matter what I teach them and how much I love them. There is no freedom here. There's no freedom here. I'll end with that.
Well said.
Yeah. Uh, Christopher, in times like this, people usually end up saying some kind of platitude like history is going to repeat itself if we don't pay attention. You're an historian. Are we about to repeat ourselves as Danita's described, and we're just going to keep ending in this note of
Um,
what do you see?
yeah, there, 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 there's certainly an opportunity to do that. And as a historian, kind of two things come to mind in regards to this, particularly in regards to people I study who have been the elite white people in Richmond. Um, and this is what troubles me is that the system of white supremacy that they built, whether in slavery or in Jim Crow or after, um, was not built by kind of the ground level rural races, but these are the elite people and people that often define themselves as well-meaning liberals of their own day. And they imagine that they were building systems of segregation that were for the best for everyone involved. They were acting on their most enlightened and liberal impulses. And we can certainly, look back and say, oh, no, 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 so much damage there. But the fact remains is they still felt that they were acting in their best impulses. And what that means to me is that do I not, as a white liberal, do I not feel the same way about myself? That I'm acting on my best, most enlightened um, impulses. And so I have to constantly uh, every day kind of ask myself the questions about what I'm seeing and what I'm not seeing, what my assumptions are, and what might be wrong with our assumptions, because there certainly is a way of, a risk of repeating history in a certain way. But the other thing that I get from history is that we're not the same people as we were in 1860 or 1902 or 1954 or even 1980. We're different people, and we have an opportunity to do differently, but we have to fight every day to do it, because we know that backlash can happen. We know that we can make the same mistakes in the past. And certainly the best way of doing that is for, listen to Chelsea and listen to Anita and listen to the young people that are telling us the right way forward.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm right there with you, man. I hope I do the right thing and listen to my heart and understand what's blocking me from truly hearing the truth. That's all the time we have for this show tonight. So I want to thank our guests. I want to thank Stan Craddock, Dale Broomfield, Danita Roundtree Green, and Chelsea Higgs Wise for this stimulating conversation. If you want to learn more about this show or hear previous episodes, go to writingourwayout.com. You can listen to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where I hope you'll subscribe. Please leave a review and a rating with Apple Podcasts. On each show, we will address your questions and comments. We would love to hear from you. There is a spot on our website where you can share your feedback. You can also reach us on Twitter and Facebook under the book title, Writing Our Way Out. Follow us, like us, reach out, and let us know what you're thinking. The theme music for this show is written and produced by Chris Coogan. You can learn more about him at cooganmusic.com. The show is produced by Rob Crocker, a PhD student in media, art, and text at Virginia Commonwealth University. Thanks for listening.